Thank you, guys. Very lovely indeed. So here we are in Joshua chapter 2. Last week we started the story, the very well-known story about Rahab and the spies. And today we will finish that narrative, that story, from verses 12 to verse 24. The book of Joshua is challenging from a preaching schematics perspective, because especially in the beginning of the book, each chapter is a story that has a beginning, middle, and end. So it's kind of hard for you to split that into two sections. This one, I've done my best. So here we have, again, part 2, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to continue to split these narratives in half, more or less. So every once in a while, we may have to tackle a whole chapter. But again, today we get to the second part of the story, the second half of the story, the conclusion. I know you guys have been waiting to find out what is going to happen with Rahab and the spies. You know, you did not read ahead or never heard of the story before. It's a cliffhanger, if you will. So you will get that information today. Let me read and you can follow along. Again, Joshua chapter 2, verse 12 to verse 24. Now, therefore, I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sister, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. So the men answered her, our lives for yours, if none of you tell this business of ours. And it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall. She dwelt on the wall. And she said to them, go to the mountain, lest the pursuers meet you. Hide there for 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Afterwards, you may go your way. So the men said to her, we will be blameless of this oath of yours, which you have made us swear, unless when we come into the land, you bind this line of scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you bring your father, your mother, your brothers, and all of your father's household to your own home. So it shall be that whoever goes outside the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we will be guiltless. And whoever is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head, if a hand is laid on him. And if you tell this business of ours, then we will be free from your oath which you made us swear. Verse 21. Then she said, according to your word, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed. And she bound the scarlet cord in the window. They departed and went to the mountain, and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers returned. The pursuers sought them all along the way, but did not find them. So the 2 men returned, descended from the mountain, and crossed over. And they came to Joshua the son of Nun, and told him all that had befallen them. And they said to Joshua, truly the Lord has delivered all the land into our hands, for indeed all the inhabitants of the country are faint-hearted because of us. So there you have it. Tension is over. Actually, not the very last bit of information pertaining to Rahab. We will see a little bit more on chapter 6, the latter part of that chapter. But here we have the conclusion of this main portion of the story of Rahab and the spies. I've made notes, and we discussed the fact that she was someone very unlikely to be thought of as a hero of faith, if you will. What was it? Lying, pagan prostitute. Nevertheless, regardless of all of those things, and most likely much more, she was praised for the faith that she had in him who can work perfectly through our imperfections, through her imperfections, through my imperfections. And as the story continues to unfold, now we have a portion where there is an agreement being proposed and being made. And I've made, a joke about this. We all know the end of the story. There is no sitting on the edge of your seat. There is nothing alarming that I just read here. But as I usually try to do, especially whenever we do cover a story that is familiar, I try to look at it from a perspective that is maybe uncommon, maybe a little bit below the surface. I think every truth in the Bible is so deep that without making things up, you can look at it from different perspectives and glean truths that are not as evident as those that you can kind of see just from a very superficial reading of a text. So I will attempt to propose an aspect of this truth that is maybe a little harder to see on the surface. And I think the superficial, on the surface truth, when we think about the story of Rahab, is of how she was used to save the spies. Wouldn't you agree? Again, an unlikely person, an unlikely scenario, but she was utilized by God to save the spies. Not only to save the spies, but to give them important information. Now, the information that they gathered, that they received from her, it wasn't so much strategic, right? She didn't say, well, here, let me draw a diagram of our city. And if you enter through these doors, or this wall that is a little weaker than the other portions of the wall, then you will, nothing like that was exchanged. What was exchanged was their demeanor, their feelings, literally their fears about what was to happen, what was to come. That was important. It continued to lift up the spirits of Joshua and the Israelites, the Hebrews, right? There was certain anxiety, certain concerns. This was a very fortified people and city. And if they were able to conquer it, then, everything else would have been doable. So still in the process of, again, building up their belief, if you will, their faith that God was going to work through all that. I think there's another way for us to look at this story. It's not only about Rahab saving the day. I think there was something else that needed to be saved. There was something actually even more precious. Again, the people of God were able to conquer the promised land partially because of Rahab. You can make that argument. But there was something even more precious that needed to be saved here. Needed to be conserved. Needed to be looked after. Let's see what that might be. Looking at the narrative, as I stated before, an agreement is being proposed here. From verse 12 to verse 13, Rahab talks to the spies and basically says, look, I've helped you out, right? Wouldn't you agree? I helped you out. I saved your behind. Now, can you please return the favor? I know you guys are on the winning team, and maybe this is the biggest portion of Rahab's insight, wisdom, picking the winning team. She went against her own people, who again, they were not too shabby. This was a very fortified city. They weren't just chumps. But she understood that there was another people who were led by a different type of God, the God, and that was the winning team. So she went against everything that she knew up till that point and said, you know what? I'm going on their side. But not only just me, I want to take my family with me. My father, my mother, my siblings. Those I care most about. So that was the proposition, right? I helped you. I saved your behind. Could you return the favor? Would that be too much to ask? They listened and they agreed. But they didn't just want to agree. Give her, a blank check. Because, this was not planned. They did not go into the land to find someone that could be saved. That was not the purpose of the stakeout, if you will. They wanted to gather information so that when they went into the land, likely everyone would have been wiped out. So what she was proposing was something different, was something novel, was something unexpected, and maybe even not condoned. We don't know the exchange that the spies had with Joshua. But again, not very likely that they went into that region looking for someone to save. So when she proposes this, they need to establish some boundaries, some perimeters. Again, I'm not just going to hand you a blank check. I agree, you saved our behind. And it seems only right, logical, that we return the favor, but under certain conditions. What were these conditions? Again, if you read through verse 14 and verse 20, essentially there were three conditions. The first one is repeated multiple times, but basically, don't tell a soul. They even explain it in a very business-like perspective, right? Don't tell people our business. Like they're, they had like ties and suits and a little briefcase. We're here on very important business. What's that business? Wiping you guys off of the face of the earth. That's our business. Here's on my business card, my logo, if you will, blood and a sword and you guys just kind of, falling down. That's our business. Don't tell a soul. Don't tell anyone our business. If you tell our business, if we leave here and you change your mind, if you try to be sneaky and tricky, this agreement is done. We will not fulfill this agreement. So be careful. Be careful who you talk to, what you say. Don't tell a soul. First portion of these conditions. The second condition was the hanging of a scarlet cord. Basically a little piece of rope, a red piece of rope. And that's very symbolic. I'm sure all of us have seen imageries of, her door and that, piece of rope, very noticeable piece of rope hanging from her doorway somewhere. This most likely triggers certain other stories that we are very familiar with, right? Maybe the one that is most pertinent, that builds this very evident parallel, is of when the plagues were at hand in Egypt, right? Passover. And the angel of the Lord was going to wipe everyone out except those who had blood, red, spread on their doorposts, on their doorways. They had to stay inside, right? So the symbolism, I think it's evident here. There's this parallel between what happened then and what is happening now. So that's the second condition, if you will, that she needed to fulfill. And it's funny, as you look at the narrative, it almost seems like as soon as they left, she's like, okay, let me tie this. I don't want to waste any time. Let me make sure that this is where it needs to be from here on. And I wonder if, the anxiety was building up, every once in a while she'd check it out to see if it was still there. Did somebody remove that? Did it fall for any reason? Let me tie that up a couple of knots. I don't know if like a strong wind is going to blow here and then, this thing is going to be taken away. The fact of the matter is, she tied it up and she left it there for those days that they were gone because she knew that they were going to come back. And the last condition was that everyone needed to stay inside the house, whomever she wanted to save. It seems like they made it very general, even though she specifically stated her father, her mother, siblings, and then they said, okay, stay inside. If somebody comes out, their blood is not on our hands. It's going to be on them, not on us. And again, very symbolic of what happened in Egypt during the Passover. So those were the conditions by which they were willing to agree. She asked, she proposed an agreement. They said, wait a minute, let's talk this through. Let's think about all the details. If you fulfill these requirements, then we agree. If not, maybe not. Well, it was mutually accepted and agreeable. The terms, I don't know if they shook hands or if they just kind of gave it a nod, but everybody agreed. So on verse 21, it states here, then she said, according to your words, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed. She bound the scarlet cord in the window. So on their way out, they listened to her bit of advice. What was her advice? Go out, hide for a while. When the people who are pursuing you come back, then you can leave. Sound advice. They listened. They followed through. And once the pursuers came back into the city, they went their way, crossed the Jordan. We don't know how they crossed it. We know that jumping ahead, God was going to do something miraculous for the entire population to cross that body of water. It doesn't seem like God did that for them, so maybe they swam. We don't know. At this time of year, it was flooded, right? So it needed to happen somehow, some way. We just don't have that insight. So they crossed over again, and they had this exchange with Joshua, right? Because that was the point. They were supposed to be there spying, surveillance, if you will. And now they are giving an account of what occurred, what they experienced. We don't know if they went through great detail. If I was Joshua and the story started, hey, we went there and we slept over a prostitute's house. I don't know if I would have started the story that way. I might have added that towards the end. But the most important part, the information that they gathered, as I've stated before, was just the temperament, right? The knowledge of the enemy's condition. Were they there just ready to fight us? Were they, did they have this sense of, that victory was already at hand on their side? No. They feared. They heard the stories. They kind of knew what was coming. They were trembling. Now it's just a matter of time. It's almost like they already know. It's inevitable what's going to happen, what's going to occur. So obviously this is feeding their faith. It's an encouragement, if you will, something that we've seen since the beginning of the story here. So now we've already kind of explained the gist of the story. We hovered through, certain things that are very much on the surface. Let's get a little deeper as we attempt to look at different perspectives of said story. And for that, we need to rely upon other texts. So let's go ahead and start at another text that Rahab is mentioned. Now, last week I read a couple of texts, one in Hebrews and the other one in James, if I'm not mistaken, where both of them essentially are explaining why Rahab was praiseworthy. It was because of her faith. But here we have another bit of information pertaining to Rahab. And if we turn to Matthew chapter 1, we see the account of Jesus' family tree. One of the two accounts that we have in the New Testament of the genealogy of Jesus. And when we look at verse 5 of Matthew chapter 1, we read, Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. And eventually, again, this leads all the way to Jesus. So this is a portion of Jesus' family tree. And what we have here is very pertinent pertaining to this story, because what's the name that we have within these other names on verse 5? Rahab. We have Rahab being part of Jesus' lineage. It is very likely that this is the Rahab. Even though in other portions of Scripture we have a reference of Rahab the harlot, here no one else has that qualifier. And it seems logical if this was another Rahab, the authors would have said Rahab, not the harlot, right? This would have been the most logical way of understanding who this person was, because she was so significant in their history. Again, very likely from a very human perspective, if not for her, things would not have started very well pertaining to their initial attempt to conquer the land. Rahab, very likely the same person that we are talking about here. But Rahab is added to another name, because at least in the beginning of this verse, we have couples, right? We have Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. So now we have Salmon and Rahab who had Boaz. So this is a couple. Salmon, the husband. Rahab, the wife. Both of them having a child. Who was this child? Boaz. Why is Boaz important? Well, Boaz plus Ruth, very familiar with the story. The result of that is what? Obed. And then Obed, whose wife is not mentioned, we don't know why, eventually has Jesse, whose wife is also not mentioned, but eventually he has David and all, his other sons, but including and most importantly David. And there we have the genealogy of Jesus, this royal family tree. Now let's think about the information that we have here in Matthew chapter 1 pertaining to Rahab and Salmon. We don't have much information about Salmon. Very little, other than he liked pink shirts. No. Not even that. We have very little, if no information about Salmon. But if we do look through certain peripheral avenues, we get a little bit more information, such as we read chapter 5, or verse 5, chapter 1 of Matthew. If we backtrack one more verse, we get another bit of information, and maybe just the second part of verse 4. And it says, Abinadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. So a little bit more information. It helps out a little bit. Now we know Salmon's father's name, Nahshon. So maybe we can find something in the Bible about Nahshon. And lo and behold, we do have some information. If we go through Exodus chapter 6, I'll read the verse if you want to just make a note of it and read it on your own later on. Exodus chapter 6. We see something important pertaining to the pedigree of this person. Nahshon. Exodus chapter 6, verse 23. It states here, Aaron took to himself Elisheba, daughter of Amminadab, sister of Nahshon, as wife. So Nahshon was Aaron's brother-in-law. Not too shabby, wouldn't you agree? Pretty good pedigree. Knows people, right? Can name drop. Hey, do you know who I'm particularly intimate with? Hang out? Invited over for Thanksgiving every once in a while? Aaron. Through my sister. But I'm kind of part of the inner circle. Pretty elite, wouldn't you agree? Pretty important. Not only this bit of information, if you go on to Numbers chapter 2, verse 3, we get a little bit more insight about this person. Numbers chapter 2, verse 3. Give you a second for those who are looking for that particular verse. And it says here, on the east side towards the rising of the sun, those of the standard of the forces with Judah shall camp according to their armies. And Nahshon, the son of Amminadab, shall be the leader of the children of Judah. Wow, even more impressive. Not only does he have pedigree pertaining to his sister being married to the high priest, it seems like he himself was in a very privileged and a leader of sorts, of Judah. This royal clan or tribe that their king would come from eventually, and that our king came from. So, pretty important. Now, why are we covering Nahshon? Well, because Nahshon was the father of Salmon, who was and eventually became the husband of Rahab. Now let's just pause for a second in history. After this account in Joshua chapter 2, we know the story. They are victorious. Eventually on chapter 6, there's a mention that they followed through and Rahab was able to live out her life amongst the Jews. And then, based on this information in Matthew chapter 1, we know that she married. Who did she marry? Pretty legitimate, important dude. Think about this for a second. Out of all of the women that Salmon could have courted, chosen Rahab, the pagan, lying prostitute, did a great thing, but come on. Wouldn't you agree that that would have been a little bit taboo? This is not a nobody. Very likely someone that had choices, that other clans and other families would have loved to give their daughters their hand in marriage. And we don't know exactly how it happened, how they met, how the process unfolded. We know the end of the story, where this very elite person within the tribe of Judah eventually married Rahab. Had kids, more kids than Jesus. Maybe, just maybe, humor me if you will. This is not just a story about Rahab saving the day. Maybe this is also a story about how God preserved the greatest royal family on earth. Rahab needed to be saved. She was in Jesus' family tree. All of this was very unlikely, borderline impossible from our perspective, but preordained. Why? Because God doesn't have second choices. God is not just reacting on history. It's not like God had someone else chosen and that person didn't show up and he's like, okay, who do I have left? Okay, Rahab, you're up. First, second, because from our perspective, that would make sense, right? God had a list of women who are very much more appropriate. None of them showed up. Some of them were late, messed up, and then, okay, who's on the bottom? Literally, who is on the bottom of my... Okay, fine, Rahab. I got no one else. All of my options were exhausted. All of my plans fell through. I guess I'll do it through Rahab. Do you think that that's how God works? The great mighty God? Unlikely. So in one way, shape, or form, Jesus' lineage would have to go through Rahab. Why? We don't know. Because God chose it. Because He preordained it. Because that was part of His sovereign will. But for that to occur, for that to happen, what needs to be done? She needs to be saved, preserved, welcomed into the fold, accepted to the point where this guy, who is very much part of their leadership, this elite person, marries her, falls in love, wants to be with her. Pretty interesting perspective, wouldn't you agree? And it's not to say that the other perspective isn't true. She did save the day, but if you compare what she did with what would happen through her, eventually, in Jesus, which one is more important? Again, all the spies did was give information pertaining to the enemy's demeanor, their feelings. Theoretically, could Joshua and the Israelites still conquer Canaan without that information? Was that essential information? They could have. It was important, but they could have. But theoretically, if this is in fact preordained, if something happened with Rahab, or the obvious happened with Rahab, how does Jesus come? The lineage is broken. The family tree is chopped down. Even before God's ultimate plan to save the world comes to fruition in the person of Jesus. Now, obviously, this was not known, expected, seems impossible, seems even borderline illegitimate. Why would God do this? We don't know. The fact of the matter is, He did it. Then think about it for a second. Through this narrative, through this story, people had their perceptions of what was happening. Joshua had his perspective. What was his perspective? I was a spy once. Now I'm in a leadership position. But that was important. So I'm going to send out the spies to scope out the land. Because I think that, again, it's strategic, right? That must be done. In these 3 days they were just kind of hanging out here. Let me gather some information. From Joshua's perspective, very likely, that was all. That was it. From the spies' perspective, do you think they knew that this was happening? No. They ended up there. God knows how. They interacted with this woman who saved their behind. She made a proposition. Imagine. Who made the proposition? Were the spies like, oh, thank you so much. Here, we're going to offer you salvation. We're going to spare you in return for your kindness. Is that what they did? No. Thank you. Have a good day. By the way, in a few days, I wouldn't stay here if I were you. She proposed it. But not only that, once she proposed it, what do? Oh, yes, for sure. No, we're going to establish all of these requirements, right? All of these requirements, because I think, we never know what you are up to. Do you think if they knew that this woman would be essential, one way or another, for the redemption of the world, that they would have acted in such a manner? They have no knowledge of that. It was impossible for them to foresee this. And we could go on and on with all the other characters of the story. Salmon. We don't know how, but he fell in love with this woman. Very likely had many other choices, but she was the one. Rahab herself, was she knowledgeable of what was to come? What was going to happen? No. But it was happening. It was happening. No one knew. No one understood. Everyone had their particular perspectives and knowledge and insight and idea. But no one could imagine what was happening in the background. What does that tell you about God's dealings? About how he works? Every once in a while we get insight into God's purposes, often in hindsight, after the fact. But you can make an assessment of your life, if you will. And maybe God gave you an inkling of his intentions real time. It might happen every once in a while. But God works in mysterious ways. That's a fact. And the more we think we have him figured out, the more we understand that we know very little, if anything. And oftentimes, we are analyzing life. We are thinking about circumstances, our stories, what is happening right now. And again, we have a perspective. Everybody has it's like belly buttons. Everybody has one. Everybody has their perspective. What they think is happening. How they are perceiving that truth. And truth be told, everyone thinks that their perspective is the best one. The right one. And then there's this other perspective that we have no access to. God's perspective. What he is doing. We can't even see it. And he's doing it. And he's working. And we can't even imagine what he is doing. Our worries in life are limited perspectives. They're feeble. They're very small and limited. And because of this, we always have to make note of the simple fact. There's always a chance that God is doing something that we can't just imagine. Oftentimes we find ourselves hopeless. Oftentimes we find ourselves discouraged about something. Oftentimes we question and we doubt. Why? Because we have a particular perspective. Oftentimes we think that God's intentions is this because it seems like the obvious. Never discount the fact that God is working. And very often, he works in ways that we can never imagine. Don't lose hope. Don't limit reality based on our limitations. Consider the possibility of the amazing things that God is doing, even though you cannot perceive it, even though you cannot imagine it, even though you have no way of knowing. God is working. Amen.